Hello friends, welcome to another 7-Minute Bible, and let's go ahead and get our timer started, and away we go. As we do something a little less daunting here than going through the entire Old Testament in 7 minutes or less, we're just going to look at the book of Genesis. So just to review some things that we talked about in a previous episode, and as we look forward to future episodes where we just begin to look at different passages in Genesis. Genesis is part of the Torah. Remember we talked about the Tanakh? So we've got the Torah, which is also known as the Pentateuch because of its 5 books, considered to be the 5 books of Moses. So we think that Moses was the author of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And so also then you've got the other sections then, the Nevi'im and the Ketuvim. So you've got the law, the prophets, and then the writings. And so we often hear that in the Old Testament, or actually in the New Testament, where Jesus and others are referring to the law and the prophets. So as to Genesis specifically, Genesis means beginning. And so we see so many beginnings here in the book of Genesis. The beginnings of creation, the beginnings of humanity, the beginning of sin and death, and ultimately the beginning of a special family through which God chose to bless the entire world. And so again, Genesis means beginning, and it covers the time period of about 4004 to 1805 BC. It happens to be the longest time frame of any book in Scripture, so it covers approximately 2,000 years or more, depending on how you look at it. It was believed to be written in about 1430 BC. And so some of the stories that we are familiar with as followers of Christ, or even just having heard some references to the Sunday school stories growing up, we have the creation story. And then we have what we would call the fall, where again sin and death enter the world. So then we have the story of Noah's Ark, as God does some recreative work, or does something there, which then shows that the people continue to struggle with sin to the point of the Tower of Babel, where the people must be scattered throughout the earth. And so we have those beginnings, and then look into the beginnings of the story of Abraham and his descendants. So we see Abraham's journey to the promised land, out of the land that God called him. He had children, Ishmael and then Isaac. Isaac is almost sacrificed at this point, but then God provides a different sort of sacrifice. And that's a foreshadow, as I always say, concerning Jesus. God ultimately provides a different sort of sacrifice than Abraham's son. But ultimately, Jesus would be seen to be the offspring of Abraham and David and so on. And so in Isaac's story, then we see the story of Jacob and Esau. And Jacob is known as the person that wrestles with God, and his name is changed to Israel, one who wrestles with God. And so that's an interesting concept to think about devotionally, that the people of Israel, or the name Israel, as given to Jacob, means to wrestle with God. And so as people of God, that's exactly what we do. We tend to wrestle with God, and we tend to struggle with God in so many ways, and yet we find God is close to us. And so Jacob then has 12 sons, through which this is developed into the 12 tribes of Israel. And then Genesis begins with the story of Joseph being essentially sold and then taken to Egypt because of some jealousies of his brothers. But then God used that to save his people as they entered a time of famine. And then it begins to set up the story of the Exodus. So some of the famous verses that we're familiar with in Genesis is Genesis 1:1, and we'll talk about this soon. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. and also Genesis 1:27. So God created human beings in his own image. In the image of God he created them, male and female he created them. So Genesis can ultimately also be broken down into two parts. You might consider the first part the prehistoric parts, everything from Genesis 1 to through 11, and then starting in chapter 12, we see the story of the patriarchs. Another way that we would refer to the stories of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so often God is referred to as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob through this lens of the patriarchs. So you've got that first 11 chapters, everything until the birth of Abraham. And so this tells the creation story, the story of the great flood, and the story of the Tower of Babel. And then from Genesis 12 through 50 is again the story of the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And then also the sons of Jacob and the story of Joseph. So there we go. That is a glance at Genesis. I hope this has been helpful to you. And don't forget to comment, share, and like these videos. And also subscribe in YouTube and ring the bell to be notified of new content. God bless you and have a great day.